Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome to yet another extra slice of Quiet Riot. I'm Naomi. Reform UK, winning 5 seats at last week's election, has taken up far too much of the media discourse already, and far too little attention has been paid to the Green Party quadrupling their seat haul, adding Bristol Central, Waveney Valley and North Herefordshire to the mix. A fascinating combination of former Labour voters flocking to them in urban areas and many former Tory voting farmers even backing them in rural areas. Added to that, they've come second in 39 seats, all of which are currently Labour held. 18 are in London and the others spread across Yorkshire, the North West, South West, even one in Wales. So joining me to chat through all of that and what is next for the Green Party, I am thrilled to be joined by their Deputy Leader, London Assembly Member, Zack Polanski. Welcome, Zack.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, you and I have long bonded over our love of proportional representation. Podcasts that I do, I almost have to put a pound in the swear jar every time I mention PR, such as my desire and longing for it. So I'm going to dive straight in with that issue to get it out of the way. Has the Green Party yet had a chance to consider how many more MPs you might be looking at if last week's election hadn't been done under our ridiculous winner-takes-all system?
Yeah, I think the question's absolutely right. It is an absurd system. And I guess the big chink of light in this whole election is that 10, 15 years ago, the times when we've been talking about this, you'd knock on the door and you'd mention proportional representation and the person behind the door would kind of look at you blankly like, what is this obscure thing that you're talking about, when really I want to talk about the cost of living crisis, completely understandably. But now I'm not having to bring it up with anyone. You go all around the country and people constantly bring up the need for proportional representation. And for a while there was a myth that we'd had a referendum in 2011 on proportional representation, but of course that was on the alternative vote, which is a system that is not proportional and in fact results often in less proportional outcomes than first past the post. But to your question, yes, absolutely. We've thought about it a lot, and I think we'd be looking at between 50 to 100 seats. Now, the thing that people immediately come back with is that, that would mean Reform would have lots of seats. And that is true. But I think the point is, as we'll see hopefully with Farage and Tice in Parliament now, is that transparency is the best disinfectant, and we can't silence people's arguments by not allowing them representation. Where they, go into hate speech, then we rightly have laws for that, and that won't be allowed in Parliament. But if someone is putting forward a legitimate argument that we happen to disagree with based on evidence and science and whatever it might be, then we need to get even better at presenting those arguments. So I've always thought that was a silly argument to not have proportional representation. And I think the only other thing I want to say is that the media have hyped up kind of Reform's rise a lot, and it is concerning, so I'm not dismissing it. But it's very interesting when you look at the Brexit Party, or UKIP, plus the Tories at the last election or in 2015, they were hitting about 48% of the vote. In this election, they're hitting about 38% of the vote. So actually, Reform have been less popular at this election. Yes, they have got more seats, but that demonstrates that even under first past the post, that can result in disproportional outcomes. So ultimately, we really need proportional representation, not because of the outcomes or what it does for parties, but ultimately it would mean that every single person's vote matters.
Right, exactly. The case for PR is about fairness for voters, not fairness for the parties.
Absolutely.
And so, if you take the LibDems, for the first time, ever, maybe, I don't know, their seat haul and their vote share aren't particularly different. Does that mean Liberal Democrats now don't support PR? No, not at all. They didn't support it for their own gain. They supported it from a principles basis, as I believe the Greens do, and other parties as well, we should add, because of the fairness for voters. But also, I think when we debunk this very common myth that you hear about, PR lets the far right in, it's about power. letting them in. What does letting them in mean? Well, what it means is they might get some seats, but what first past the post enables them to do is to seize power. When we look at Meloni over in Italy, I've said it before in this show, the only reason she has power is because of the first past the post portion of Italy's hybrid system. When you look at PR elections in Europe and rerun them under first past the post, you get the National Front sweeping up power with sort of 90% plus of the seats on a minority of the vote share. So what PR also does is it, as you say, sunshine is a disinfectant, exposing people, holding them to account in a much more robust way. But it really makes it immeasurably more difficult for them to get total power. So we've got that out of the way, Zack. We agree on PR. Let's keep campaigning for it. But let's stick also, I think, with a bit of analysis of LibDems and Greens. The LibDems, like the Greens, pursued this hyper-targeted election campaign. And it certainly paid off for them in terms of first places. They got a record-breaking 72 MPs, but at the expense of now having only 27 second places to your 39. All but 5 of theirs are Tory-facing, and all of the Green second places are Labour-facing. What do you think this might mean in terms of political realignment among opposition parties holding Labour to account?
Well, if I start with the Green Party, because that's obviously the easiest one for me to speak to, I think we're in exactly where we need to be, which is holding this Labour government to account. Now, that doesn't mean opposing for opposition's sake. It means agreeing when they get things right. I'm really pleased to see them drop the Rwanda scheme. Chris Stark, I think, is an extremely important and exciting appointment, as is Timpson. So I think there's a fair few things that the Labour Party are getting right already, and that's good to see. However, things like the child benefit cap, keeping 250,000 children in poverty, a refusal to repeal the anti-strike laws, not just for recent ones, but going all the way back to the 70s, and of course their U-turn on their supposedly flagship £28 billion climate pledge are all things we are going to be nipping at their heels for. Now, we'd be doing that anyway, but also the fact that we are in second place in those places is really exciting, and there's a whole wall around East and Inner London where, as an Assembly member, I've already been very aware of the influence we can have on the Labour Party because, as you said, I'm elected as a London Assembly member, and Sadiq Khan frequently shifts positions because of the Greens. And it's not just me saying that, by the way. Sadiq Khan, credit to him, has said several times in public that the Greens, he calls it, we chivvy him along. I wouldn't quite put it like that. I'd say we hold him to account and that shifts his position. But whatever language you want to use, the point is you don't have to be in power, and you don't even have to have an MP sometimes, that if you are a legitimate political threat, behaviour will already start to change. And we saw that in Bristol Central, by the way, with Thangam Debonair. As the campaign went on, she increasingly started to try and pitch to the left to appeal to the Green vote. On Gaza, she did end up voting for a ceasefire in the end, despite it looked initially like she was going to abstain. So things like that, you can legitimately change people's votes by being a genuine electoral threat. In terms of the Liberal Democrats, I think they do have an interesting issue there because they've run this kind of hyper-focused campaign, but I don't think there's necessarily a unified thread to what all these MPs are doing. Now, that's not true for everything. I think social care, for instance, very much at the heart of the campaign, and credit again to Ed Davey, who put his own personal experience at the heart of the campaign. I don't think anyone can not be moved by his experiences on that and how he talks about that. But get a little bit further into it, and I don't think it's quite clear where they're going with that. And it might be that I've not paid them enough attention to be fair to them, but I think it's a little bit amorphous. Now, that's something that's often thrown at the Green Party, particularly now that we have 2 seats that were Labour-facing and 2 seats that were Conservative-facing. But I think that more points to the fact that on the Green Party message, you can win anywhere. And the Green Party message, I would say, is very clear, which is tax multimillionaires and billionaires, the very wealthy, to pay for our public investment and make sure that public services remain in public hands. And I think we've got that very clear message that has cut through. I'm not convinced the LibDems have that, but they have a lot more MPs now to be able to build that message.
Quiet, Riot. When we look at where the LibDems were under the last Labour government, with Charles Kennedy leading them, they were really quite effectively able to oppose the Blair administration from the left over issues like tuition fees, penny in the pound on income tax, Iraq war, as very obvious examples. They then had 63 MPs as of 2005 and had lots of seats in more rural areas in the southwest, in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. They were kind of this non-conformist, anti-establishment party. Now, when we look at where their seats are, they are in incredibly affluent areas in large number in the southeast of England, all down that sort of M4 corridor area through Oxfordshire, but they have picked up some seats in Somerset and Devon and Cornwall. So I wonder if they will now have a bit of an internal battle over whether they are doubling down on holding those former Conservative seats and appealing to the more Cameronite kind of voter, or whether they are in a trickier balancing act because they now do have some of these previously held non-conformist Liberal seats in further away areas in the southwest and Scotland.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting in terms of, like, are they now going to be the main opposition to the Labour government on that kind of pro-European centre-right, opening up the space for the Green Party to do what Kennedy did with the LibDems in the noughties? Is that something that you sort of feel might be a bit of a realignment?
I feel like that's happened already, actually, and obviously how people vote and what happens in this parliament will be the real demonstration of it. But I had a taste of this a few days before the end of the campaign.
Oh, go on. Love a bit of insider information.
Well, I had a debate with Wes Streeting and Daisy Cooper, both speak really, really well, so this is no kind of reflection on their ability to communicate. But me and Wes were going at it on NHS privatisation, and I just felt that Daisy didn't quite know where to place herself in that conversation. Now, that's not Daisy not knowing how to place herself. I think that's for Liberal Democrats, and I think they do have a choice at this point about where they fall, but I think because of everything you just outlined, I think they will fall to the centre-right. And I think what's happening there when the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, and to some extent the Conservatives, although they'll obviously go even further right, well, not obviously, but I think potentially will go even further right to try and get that reform vote back, that does leave a huge open space for the Green Party, which I think we've been occupying already. It's just some of the other parties have pretended to occupy it at times whilst occupying other areas, but they already seem to be shifting away and leaving that space for us. I think that's our natural space, and I think it's a good space for us to be in, and I think that's why the Green Party as a whole are incredibly buoyant right now. I think the other thing as well is, back to a proportional representation conversation, but Labour got 9 million votes, the Green Party got nearly 2 million votes, and I just think it's this sense that sometimes the Green Party during the campaign, our policies were painted sometimes by the media as if, we're extreme or fringe. But actually, the numbers are totally countering to that. And actually, a lot of our policies are incredibly popular. And when there's polling that is anonymous polling, or you say to people, if you weren't worried about voting for someone who you could win, but you were voting on policy, the Green Party frequently do really well in those polls. So I think this is an exact moment for us to be pushing some of those policies and hopefully getting them adopted by other parties. But if they're not adopted by other parties, that's, again, just another huge space for us to come in at the next election.
Fascinating, but let's face it, the Green Party is not without its own tension. You've got Carla Denyer MP, Sian Berry MP, representing the relatively affluent urban areas of Bristol Central and Brighton Pavilion, respectively. You've got Adrian Ramsey MP and Ellie Chown MP, with much more rural seats of Waveney Valley and North Herefordshire. Do you foresee conflict or tension for the party over issues like planning reform, new homes, new energy infrastructure? Because a common criticism I hear about the Greens is that far too many of your councillors up and down the country, and you have got an enormous number of councillors now, are blocking development in areas that desperately need things like new homes.
Yeah, I think this is a criticism that's come directly from the Labour Party and right-wing Labour at that. But I'm always happy to counter it head on. Our argument has always been that we need lots more homes. Those need to be the right homes, and they need to be primarily social or council housing, and those need to be built, but we need to be prioritising brownfield sites first. So this is essentially about the right homes in the right places at the right price. It is absurd that right now there are homes going up across London that will need to be retrofitted in just a few years' time. It is absurd, again in London, but I can make these examples for elsewhere, that there is enough brownfield site that TfL own, Transport for London, that if you put them all together, you'd have a constituency the size of a Camden. happen. Now, for property developers, they of course are going to want to demonise, or at least to criticise, parties that say we don't need luxury developments or unaffordable housing, because property developers make a lot of money from luxury developments and unaffordable housing. So for me, this is much more a question about lobbying, about transparency around that, and about really pushing this Labour government have already ruled out public investment in council housing, which is absolutely absurd. It was excellent to see Vicky Spratt, who's the independent writer on housing, talking about this whole supply and demand argument is essentially a false argument when it comes to homes, because ultimately you can build all the homes that you want, but if people can't afford them, that is not going to bring the prices down. And we already have a lot of empty homes in Britain. So yes, we need more homes, but what we don't need is more empty buildings, and we don't need more communities that don't have infrastructure like NHS, dentists, a GP practice, proper transport to get there, and proper infrastructure. And then on renewable infrastructure, yes, we absolutely do need more renewable infrastructure. I know that Adrian has been criticised because it's been wrongly reported that he is trying to stop a pylon. That is just not true when it's come from the Telegraph.
Stop. You mean that the Telegraph may have done a sensationalist, factually inaccurate bit of reporting? I don't believe you.
I think I might just be suggesting that. I think there's a fair to say that in politics there is a tension between what the local community sometimes want and what the national kind of picture needs in terms of infrastructure. But I would just point to our record. In Brighton, when we controlled the council, not with a majority, but we built record numbers of homes. In York, we won awards for the number of council homes we built. Mid-Suffolk, which is where Waveney Valley is, the only Green majority council in the country, has won an award this year for being Council of the Year. So some of these cases that sometimes get picked where the Greens have blocked a housing development, what gets failed to mention is that the other parties also block the same development. And I think ultimately if a development is not good for the area, or is not good because it's not bringing affordable housing or social or council homes, then that should be blocked. That's an example of councillors doing the job that they need to do. So I'm always happy to take this question head on, because I think it's a really curious thing about the media, how stories can start to seep in. And I saw this election with anti-Semitism as well. And it was really clear to me that, as a Jewish person, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, a release of all hostages and an end to arms trades to Israel, how quickly the media very quickly started to try and call me anti-Semitic until they realised that I'm one of only 5 Jewish people in British political history who've ever been in leadership. And I am Jewish, and I was also calling for this. So that kind of waned off, but they still tried to smear the party. Now, that's not to say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It's not to say that it shouldn't be taken incredibly serious, as Islamophobia too. But it is a much wider question about how things get told in the media by people like the Telegraph that then kind of get circulated into talking points as if they're suddenly true. And I think we always need to come back to what is the evidence, what is the source of these stories. If there are criticisms that are true, those need to be taken seriously. And I'm not ever saying that the Green Party don't have questions to ask about things, as any political party does. But I also think it's really important that these questions always happen transparently on the basis of evidence, rather than what other rival political parties try to paint about you.
Now, you mentioned that you are a London Assembly member, and, as I mentioned, the Green Party has a very strong vote share showing across the capital, incredibly so in parts of South London, East London. I was looking up some of the numbers: 24% vote share in Hackney, 20% in Walthamstow. Does this reflect your vote distribution in local and assembly elections, or was something else happening last week at the general election?
So I don't think it's reflective of the ones that have happened previously, and I can't prove this, but I'm almost certain that was because we had a Conservative government and people wanted to get the Tories out. I wanted to get the Tories out. And the last London Assembly election, I don't think in my political lifetime we will face a harder election in terms of having 14 years of Conservative austerity, underinvestment, services that were broken, and people just wanting anything different. So I spent that whole London election pretty much explaining that voting Green was not going to let the Tories in London, and it was nothing to do with the national government. But having Susan Hall, or the spectre of Susan Hall, raised by Sadiq Khan, made that election a really tricky election to try and cut through with.
Lewis Baston, the psephologist, he tweeted earlier that Susan Hall got more votes in the London Assembly election for the Conservatives than the sum total of votes for Conservatives last week in London at the general election.
That's so interesting. Yeah, so I don't really know what's going on there, other than Rishi Sunak was so incredibly unpopular, even more unpopular than Susan Hall. I suppose if you're someone who supports reform or you're on, the right of politics, Susan Hall is pretty clear about where she stands, and I suppose you've got someone obvious to vote for. Rishi Sunak, I would say, is clearly on the right of politics, but I think he did a little dance where maybe even if you're on that side of the Conservative Party, you feel like, well, I might as well vote for reform because Farage is back in the game. It's really hard to get your head inside what that voter is thinking. I think it's really important to do so, because I think it's really important when you vehemently disagree with people to not dismiss them or not assume that they're lost causes and try and work out what's going on. But I'd be lying if I said to you on this podcast that I'd really worked that out. I think there's a deep anti-establishment feeling in the country, and I think that's probably the biggest danger we're facing, because if the Labour Party can deal with people's material issues, that cost of living crisis, the sense that transport's too expensive, that the country is broken, that Brexit has been a disaster, if they can deal with those things, then we can stave off reform and stave off that rise.
But there must be some demographic factors at play for the Green vote in London in particular. It must surely be highly educated younger people in desperate need of better housing that are beginning to now find it completely safe and acceptable to vote Green in a way that perhaps they didn't previously.
Yeah, so I think it's those two things. I think, one, people are realising it's safe and acceptable. I think also people have realised more and more that although we deeply care about the environment, and that's at the forefront of everything we do, we are intersectional, so we care just as much about housing, renting, a police force that isn't under-protecting and over-policing minority communities, that we care just as much about transport being affordable and accessible, and we care just as much about making sure that the National Health Service stays a nationalised service. So I think that's partly more education or more knowledge about the Green Party. And then I think the second thing, I think it's what I was coming to, is if the Labour Party continue to govern as they have campaigned and keep the child benefit cap, refuse to stand up for workers' rights, don't call for international justice in the way that people see as fair and transparent, then that does leave a vacuum, and Nigel Farage is ready to fill that vacuum. But I think that's where the Green Party have a huge role to play, which is ultimately to saying that to those people who are sick and tired of the two old parties, that there is an alternative, and you don't have to vote out of fear. You can vote with your heart, and you can vote on something that's much more ambitious and visionary and feels much more hopeful. And I think that's why at this election we saw that huge rise in the Green Party share. I still think there was a whole lot of tactical voting going on. So I think at the next election, and indeed in the elections between then, I expect us to see us rise at the London Assembly and at the London Council elections, as I do around the whole country.
So in a way, what is, I think, most remarkable about the Green Party, and this is not meant to be a podcast blowing smoke up your arse,
I'd like that episode.
but is that transition from a single issue party. You've barely mentioned the environment on this call now. You've talked about housing, you've talked about infrastructure, you've talked about workers' rights, you've talked about constitutional reform. You haven't yet talked about Europe, and Brexit was very much the elephant in the room during the election campaign. I did hear Caroline Lucas pipe up and speak about it occasionally, but there was a kind of like an agreed omerta between all of the parties to not really talk about it too much. North Herefordshire and Waveney obviously will probably have a very different reaction to Brighton and Bristol over the issue of Europe, although farmers who now in those seats are beginning to vote Green rather than Conservative, sort of leapfrogging over other parties to make that transition, have to an extent, I think, come to realise what a lie they were sold over Brexit. But where does the party stand now in Europe?
Yeah, so I did talk about Europe during the campaign, but I totally accept that you and nearly everyone wouldn't have heard it because we just don't get the same media time as some of the other parties. In fact, I think I was on a BBC debate where I said that it's really clear to me that our future lies in Europe, that international problems require international solutions. And if the European Union didn't exist, you would have to create a European Union to be able to deal with those problems. And the fact that we placed ourselves out of that and placed ourselves out of the single market and customs union has been so incredibly damaging to us.
And will Ellie and Adrian be able to say that in the way you...
Yeah, and I've definitely heard Adrian say that, and I think I've not heard Ellie say that just because I've not heard her ask the question, but she's, of course, a former Green MEP, so I don't think it'd be a surprise to me. So I'm not being disingenuous. Do I think we're going to rejoin Europe in this parliament? No, I don't. And I think if people talk in that way, it loses credibility. But I also think in the exact same breath, you can clearly say we need to rejoin the European Union as soon as the conditions are right. Now, the conditions shouldn't be something that are totally external to the political conversation. This is about conversations like this, where politicians show the leadership and talk about the benefits of Europe. Do I think European Union is perfect? No, I don't. And I don't expect you to either, Naomi. I think there's huge issues with the European Union. But when push comes to shove, are we better in? Yes, we absolutely are. And I think we've got to continue to make that argument. And I think also pointing out, exactly, it was presupposed in your question, but the utter dishonesty around in which that campaign was fought and what we're seeing now, and the kind of poetic irony of having Nigel Farage in Parliament now after Brexit, pointing at Brexit, saying it's not worked and it's just because we didn't do it quite right, requires, as my family would say, quite a lot of chutzpah. And I think he needs to be called out on that and needs to be held to account for that. And it's another example of why, I'm not delighted he's in Parliament, but it's actually quite helpful because he can be answerable for that in a way that, Boris Johnson has disappeared.
You just mentioned your family. You are a London Assembly member, but you have roots in Manchester, where the Green Party have got not one, not two, but 3 second places. Zack, give me an exclusive. Are you tempted to run as an MP next time? And if so, would you be tempted to return north?
I can give you an exclusive. I'm very tempted to run as an MP next time. And I don't think I've said that anywhere else yet. So it is an exclusive.
Yay! Scoop!
Where that is a genuine question that I don't know, and that's partly because this is something politicians say all the time, but I really mean it. My number one focus at the moment is what's next for the Green Party, and in fact I'm about to go on a tour of the UK over the next few months, visiting those constituencies where we've come second place in order to mobilise local parties there, but also bring people in who aren't from those local parties to do genuine community organising, to have a kind of open debate about what's next for the Green Party. We've got this base of power now with our 4 MPs, our 3 London Assembly members, our over 840 councillors. But what does success look like next time? Are we looking to get 10 MPs at the next election, or is that actually under ambitious and we should be looking at a whole lot more than that? And I think those conversations are up for debate, which is exactly why I want a conversation for it. I would say I do live in Walthamstow, and Stella Creasy just yesterday on her first day of Parliament, she tweeted, did she attack Nigel Farage or criticise reform? Nope. Did she talk about the Conservative Party and their legacy in government? No, she attacked the Green Party, and in fact she attacked the Green Party on the same Telegraph story that we're just talking about, which lacked all of nuance. So Walthamstow, does definitely have a temptation to it, because frankly I think people in my local area deserve better.
What was the line of her attack?
She was talking about the fact that the Green Party were trying to stop renewable projects. Adrian Ramsey his day job has been to work for renewable projects for the last few years, and I think calling for a review of all options is very different to saying that you're trying to stop something. So I just felt it was disingenuous. But it wasn't even about the attack, that people are welcome to criticise the Green Party. But I think in Walthamstow it's very clear that the Labour Party swing went down 16% and the Green Party swing went up 16%. So there was a direct correlation between the fall of the Labour Party and the rise of the Green Party. So I'm not surprised that Stella is nervous about the Green Party, but I think that's exactly the wrong way to do it, is to come out on the attack as opposed to going, how can I be lobbying this government to be pushing more on social justice, more on climate justice, more on workers' rights, more on the European Union, all the things that we're talking about. So if Stella continues to attack, then that becomes a very interesting seat indeed.
Tempting, very tempting.
I've not decided, because partly it's about what's next for the party, and I think the second piece is the party is too white and middle class. That is not dismissing the contribution that lots of marginalised groups and working class communities are playing in the party. It's come on a whole long way, and there are lots of people in the party who are elected councillors who are from marginalised groups and or working class groups, so they're doing an incredible amount of work, but it's not where I want it to be yet. So I'm seeing another huge priority to increase who is being represented, because I want our future councillors and MPs to be as diverse and representative as our communities.
Well, finally, Zack, the other thing you and I have in common beyond our passion for PR is veganism.
Of course.
Now, not all vegans vote Green, but are all Green MPs vegan?
All vegans should vote Green. Adrian and Carlos, so the 2 co-leaders with me in the leadership team of 3, are vegans, so our entire leadership team is vegan. I was about to say I'm pretty sure Sean is vegetarian, but I shouldn't say that on record because I don't know, and I'm not sure about Ellie. But I think the wider point is this, though.
Yeah, well, give our listeners the environmental case for switching to a plant-based diet.
Oh, I mean, that's so easy, right? In terms of reducing emissions, in terms of the amount of farmland that is being used for livestock who are eating crops, which is also really bad for food insecurity. But my arguments of being vegan are actually separate to the environmental ones, which I think are very strong. It's just about cruelty and love and compassionate to living beings. Now, just to be clear, I don't think everyone needs to go vegan. I would love everyone to go vegan, but ultimately what we need is systems change, and that's exactly where the Green Party is aimed at, is how do we change businesses and governments to make different decisions. So I think there's very legitimate arguments for how do we push schools and hospitals and our public institutions to reduce meat intake. Now, there's several ways you can do that. You can make plant-based the default option. So it doesn't mean people can't ask for meat, and I think there's certain communities where it would feel very difficult to say you absolutely cannot have meat in this public place, although I'd still love to have that conversation down the line. But I think for now, just making the plant-based meal the number one on the menu, the thing with the biggest font, and if someone wants meat, they ask for it rather than it just being there by default, and certainly not the first option. So that's where I'd like to see things go. But the environmental case as well, we do live in a climate crisis. We need to reduce our emissions, and factory farming ultimately is really bad for our planet too, and we have far too much monoculture. When you're on a train and you see rolling hills, it's been classed as very beautiful, and so I won't lie, there is a beauty to it, but ultimately when the land is so sparse and so lacking in biodiversity, that's also really awful for the ecological emergency too. So there are loads of good reasons why you should personally go vegan if you have the privilege or the option to be able to do that. But if you can't do that for whatever reason, voting Green and lobbying your MP to push for reform around animal welfare and to reduce meat intake is a huge thing you can do on the systemic level.
Oh, he doesn't miss a beat, does he, listeners? Getting that Green Party plug in, even though we have just got through the election.
There's another one coming. Absolutely. We never stop.
Zack, we've got to wrap up. But thank you so much for joining us on Quiet Riot.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listeners, do leave us a review if you enjoyed the show, and come and find us on social media at Quiet Riot Pod. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again very soon. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canellu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global. Quiet Riot. Amazing. Right,
well, thank you so much. That was really fun.
How do I oh God, I've never done this before. Alex always does it and I don't know how to end recording. Stop.